Welcome. Grab your favorite morning beverage and join us for Morning Cannolis with Jim Santel.
You don't know me, but I'm your brother.
Sampling the news desserts of the week, here is your host, Jim Santel.
Good morning and welcome to our weekend review, our analysis and our discussion of those most important stories, those news items in law, in government, and the aspiration for justice in America. Thank you for joining me on this 2-hour broadcast coming out of Civic Media. We're here this morning, the studios of WAUK in downtown Waukesha. As always, we're at the Shaw, 540 AM, 101 FM. My producer and I are here also to solicit, to take, to entertain your phone calls, your thoughts, your comments, your questions. That number is 844-967-2789. One more time, that's 844-967-2789 here on Morning Cannolis. It is Saturday, February 18th, 2023. This is our 35th broadcast since beginning way back in June of last year. And as always, our syllabus, our academic approach, our plan this morning, as always, is ambitious. Lots and lots of things to talk about this morning, but also, hopefully, both informative and inspiring in ways big and small. We always ask these three questions. What happened? What are the facts about what took place this past week in those areas of law, government, and justice in America? Why is it important? Why do we care? Why is it relevant to our lives and our livelihoods here in these United States of America and right here in the state of Wisconsin? What is relevant about those news developments? And third, often, what do we do about it? What is the action that we take? What is the active thing that we can do in response to good things and sometimes challenging things in our nation? We're going to talk about all of those questions, hopefully get some answers along the way with your participation. Again, this morning on Morning Cannolis, we do have a very aggressive but ambitious and approachable agenda for this morning. We're going to talk a lot about a principal issue this morning, and that is revisiting in many ways this continuing notion that the 2020 election was stolen. And believe it or not, this past week, in all of those areas, in law, in government, and in justice in America, huge numbers of stories, some of them in the headlines, others of them not so much, that reaffirm fundamentally at core this notion that the big lie was just that. It's big and it's a lie. That there was, in fact, voter fraud in the 2020 election. Nothing could be further from the truth. We have lots of stories this week to talk about, to analyze, that reaffirm the fundamental notion that our elections in the state of Wisconsin, throughout the United States of America, including the election coming up just this week and again in April here in the state of Wisconsin, is safe, it's secure, it is reliable, and it is premised upon the good and outstanding work of poll workers, of people, supervisors, clerks, who make certain that our elections here in these United States have integrity. An affirmation this past week in so many different ways. I'm going to talk about a defamation lawsuit involving Dominion voting machines, which we've talked about before. I'm going to talk about what's going on in Fulton County in Georgia. Fani Willis and the DA there, who is probably on the verge sometime very soon of returning grand jury indictments against people who attempted to undermine the election there in contravention to the notion that these elections there and throughout the nation are safe and secure. I'm going to go back to Washington, talk a little bit about Jack Smith, his focus likewise on January 6th, this notion once again that the election was stolen and needed to be resolved through some overthrow of the government, completely wrong once again. We'll talk a little bit about Mar-a-Lago and classified documents along the way. I'm going to talk about the release just this past week of information that Donald Trump knew all along that the election was in fact safe and secure, legitimate, and that he had lost. We're going to talk about one additional defendant among the 1,000 or so among the January 6 defendants who have been brought into the halls of justice for their violent behavior on that day. And then also talk about what's happening with respect to the seditious conspiracy trials that continue to go on in Washington, D.C., in the federal district courts there. And again, some very interesting engagement of the defendants there with the former president. That's the tease for probably our second hour this morning. All of them related to this notion that our election in 2020, safe, secure, legitimate, and right in the end. And so we begin this morning, as we always do, with a look back in history. And this morning, once again, lots, if not all, of our historical look backs also connect, as it always does. History always connects back to the present, right? And so in 1861, February 18th, 1861 was the day that Confederate President Jefferson Davis was inaugurated in a place called Montgomery, Alabama. Alabama, the start of the Civil War, inaugurated at that time as the president, the executive of what was going to be a new nation, the Confederacy. Obviously, you know well, Civil War prevented that from happening. The leadership, the dramatic leadership of Abraham Lincoln preventing that from happening. And of course, one of America's most grisly, horrific wars, plainly the only war fought on our own lands in the wake of our own Revolutionary War, the Civil War of 1861 to 1865. How is that related to today's case? Well, we're still seeing ramifications of that, right? We know that today we continue to fight in many ways the battle for voting rights. We emancipated through the Emancipation Proclamation issued by the President Lincoln at the time. We emancipated the slaves at that time, but we're still fighting for fair voting. And indeed, coming out of Alabama, the very place in 1861 that Confederate President Jefferson Davis was inaugurated, we have a Supreme Court case pending right now in front of our United States Supreme Court in 2023, challenging the options, the opportunities for people of all races, all national origins, of all colors, of all immutable characteristics to vote in America. We've talked about that before. We're going to talk about that certainly in the future as well. 1885, February 18th, 1885, Mark Twain published The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. I suspect that many of us, if not all of us, required reading in high schools, colleges. Why does that reverberate to this day? It's also one of those books that has sometimes found its place on the list of books being banned in America in 2023. This lion of academics and of literature in America, writing The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, sometimes today on those lists of banned books, horrifically robbing young people, middle-aged people, and elderly people of the capacity, the ability to enjoy this great, wonderful, meaningful, lesson-filled story about America. 1965, February 18th, 1965, was the day that a church deacon named Jimmy Lee Jacobson was beaten and shot. He was, as a result of that event, in the context of some peaceful marches that were taking place in Marion, again in Alabama. He was shot, he was beaten, and as a result of that, his death 8 days later, it inspired the Selma to Montgomery watches of those times and the marches that took place between Selma and Montgomery that are now a part of our nation's history. We know today that the beating death of Tyree Nichols continues to reverberate in our national consciousness and our national horror once again. Just yesterday in Memphis, the 5 police officers who've been charged with the heinous, horrific murder of Tyree Nichols early in January of this year were arraigned before a district court trial judge there in Memphis. Each one of them pled guilty. We hasten to add, as we always do, that all defendants in America on our Constitution, under the Constitution of Tennessee, are presumed innocent until proven guilty. Nonetheless, yesterday, all 5 of them arraigned in that criminal proceeding, probably going to trial, if not later this year, sometimes next year, as pretrial proceedings proceed, again, in the wake of what happened to Jimmy Lee Jacobson way back in 1965, reverberations today, to this day, as the judge in the Tyree Nichols case reminds us all about the right to trial, right to a fair trial, and this notion that in America, we exalt and we focus on the rule of law, something that the family of Tyree Nichols also expressed yesterday in the wake of that arraignment, the aspiration for justice, the anticipation that whatever happens in that trial, that justice is done. It was in 1970, February 18th of 1970, that the Chicago defendants, the Chicago 7 defendants, were found guilty of inciting riots in previous times. They were found guilty, and of course, that also reverberates today as we think about another riot that happened on January 6th And that one, again, also being the focus of a lot of attention, not just recently, but also this morning, once again, as we talk about updated recent stories in our national lives and livelihood. 2001, February 18th, was the day that an FBI agent named Robert Hansen was arrested for spying on behalf of the Soviet Union. He was subsequently convicted for that offense conduct and sentenced to life in prison and remains in federal prison to this day. Robert Hansen on this day in 2001. And of course, that too has its reflections in the news of 2023. You'll recall well, as we talked on this broadcast and others of civic media, that just recently this now former FBI special agent named Charles McGonigal was also arrested. What? For engaging with a Russian oligarch, his name Oleg Deripaska, investigating him, but also on his payroll at the same time that the FBI is investigating him for his conduct. Deripaska, of course, under indictment based upon the Mueller investigation of now a couple of years ago. So once again, that history repeating itself again and again. It was in 2014, this day in 2014, that the Ukrainian Revolution began. Protesters, rioters, shooters in Kyiv, a capital in the nation of Ukraine that we continue to hear about even to this day. The overthrow of the Ukrainian government at that time, the autocratic government of Viktor Yanukovych at that time, happened on this day in 2014, leading, of course, ultimately to the democracy, the republic that we know in that nation today, that is now being not only stressed but attacked by Russia and Putin. And as the Ukrainians push back on that, they certainly remember the days when they did not have a democracy of the past. And finally, another important date that brings us to a programming note, and that is in 1988. It was February 18th, 1988, that a man named Anthony Kennedy was sworn in as our 106th Supreme Court Justice. Anthony Kennedy, again, who recently retired, leaving another vacancy in the Supreme Court that was then occupied by another justice confirmed by the Senate. We're going to talk more about the consequences of that and talk about a programming note related to the Supreme Court right after this first break here on Morning Cannolis here in the studios of WAUK Radio. And we are back this morning, February 18th of 2023. Thank you so much for joining me and my producer, Calvin. We're taking your phone calls this hour and next hour, as always, at 844-967-2789 as we begin this hour, this segment, to launch into some of the major stories that are animating justice and law and government in America. Right before the break, I was reviewing some of the major events that took place on February 18th, including on February 18th of 1988, the swearing in, the investiture of Anthony Kennedy as our 106th Supreme Court Justice. Of course, his ultimate resignation, he remains alive, very much a part of our national jurisprudence, led the way to the appointment of subsequent Supreme Court justices, including an individual who served as his law clerk at the time that Justice Kennedy was on the Supreme Court. His name, of course, Brett Kavanaugh. We also know that Donald Trump, the president at that time, also appointed two other Supreme Court justices, Amy Coney Barrett and Neil Gorsuch, obviously changing dramatically, moving in the direction of a conservative view. The United States Supreme Court, again, lots to talk about there, and that does, in fact, lead us into what I promised would be the special programming note discussed a little bit on last week's show, but also reminding you about what's going to be coming up the next 3 Saturdays. That is February 25th, March 4th, and March 11th. Calvin and I are going to be presenting to you a 3-part series, very much focused upon the Supreme Court. It's been a while since we've talked about that. We know well the Supreme Court is in the midst of its 2022-2023 term, began on October 1 of this past year. We have gone through October, November, December, January, February, not quite halfway through the 12-month term of the support of the Supreme Court, but knowing that in the coming 5 months, some major decisions coming up in very important areas that we have discussed before, major cases to be decided. We're going to go back and do some updates on those, some things that have happened in connection with the oral arguments on many of those cases, 4 months before those major decisions come out, probably in May, in June of this year, perhaps also in July. And along with all of that focus, 3 major components of these special programs coming up the next 3 Saturdays. A little bit of review of how the court works, how it operates, what's its structure, its process, its procedure. Lots of good civics coming up there, animated by many of your questions, your comments along the way about how we get there, how the Supreme Court does its business, sometimes plainly in secret, sometimes very much in public. We're going to revisit some of those core civics issues. We're going to talk about some major cases, 1 or 2, that define America in the 21st century. That's a difficult thing to wrap our heads around. I'm going to chat about 1 or 2 of those that continue to animate who we are today. And then we're going to talk about recent news of the Supreme Court having to do with ethics, having to do with things like the leak of the Dobbs decision, having to do with the demeanor of Supreme Court justices, both on and off the bench. Lots of things, once again, in the news on a regular basis. So look forward to those broadcasts coming up February 25th, March 4th, and March 11th, a renewed focus upon the Supreme Court as we anticipate these major decisions coming up later this year. And finally, I want to comment upon one more thing that's happening tomorrow, and that is we're going to observe a dark time, a dark event in American history. February 19th, 1942. So 1942, but on February 19th, tomorrow was the day that Executive Order 9066 was issued by a president named Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Don't expect any of us to remember what the number of that is, but the name of it and the content of it certainly reverberates to this day. FDR authorized on February 19th of 1942 the forced removal of all persons under this executive order deemed to be a threat to the national security from the West Coast to so-called relocation centers further inland. That was what the executive order read on that day. We know well what this is all about. This was the internment of Japanese Americans based upon this completely unsupported belief that Japanese Americans, residents, and many of them citizens, would somehow compromise our nation's security and well-being just by virtue of their national heritage. Over the period of the next 6 months, in the wake of that executive order on February 19th, over 122,000 men, women, and children of Japanese ancestry in this nation, 70,000 of those American citizens of our nation, were moved forcibly to these so-called assembly centers, these relocation centers. We know them now as internment camps. They were evacuated and they were confined in these isolated, forced removal locations. They were fenced in. They were guarded relocation centers. These internment camps held them for many years. They were in Colorado, Idaho, Arkansas, Wyoming, California, Utah, and Arizona. We know at the same time that even though this was going on, no suggestion at all that they would be less than fully allegiant, as would all other Americans. But we know at the time that Japanese Americans controlled less than 4% of California's farmland in 1940. But believe it or not, they produced more than 10% of the total value of the state's farm resources. And so again, taking those wonderfully productive, those American citizens and interning them into these camps, truly a violation of civil rights, human rights. Stunningly, once again, as you well know, the Supreme Court affirmed the legitimacy, the legal rightness of that order in a case called Korematsu. Again, a spot, a blot on the Supreme Court history, ultimately discounted and effectively disassociated from the Supreme Court by John Roberts, our present Supreme Court Justice, but nonetheless remains a part of our history. And in 1988, in the wake of all that, not that long ago, the United States Congress passed some additional legislation beyond some World War II legislation that acknowledged the injustice of that 1942 executive order, Public Law 100-383. It provided some neutral restitution, some partial restitution, $20,000 to each individual. So all of that happening again on February 19th, following the executive order of that day. Come back right after this break. We're going to take some callers and then begin to talk about those other major issues in America in 2023. Stay with us. We are back in this, our first hour of our weekend review, analysis, and discussion of law and government and the aspiration for justice in America. We're going to launch shortly into our morning discussion of some of these major news stories just from this past week that reaffirm once again this notion that the 2020 presidential election was not stolen. We've got that affirmation from many different venues, many different places, all to the same end, that the big lie was just that, a lie and big, and that there is nothing to be concerned about when it comes to the legitimacy of our elective process in America. Before we get to all that, we do have some callers, which we appreciate tremendously. Your comments, your questions, your perspectives. Let's begin with Dana from La Crosse. Dana, glad to have you with us this morning.
Good morning, Jim. Beautiful Saturday out there today.
It is.
First of all, like always, I just want to thank you for your show. It's just a topical, timely show to have for the people. I'm just wondering why you weren't around sooner, but you really do a good job of explaining the law and reminding the people that we are a nation of laws and how that law is supposed to work.
Absolutely.
So thank you so much.
I appreciate
hope
that
to hear
comment
you
so
for
much.
years to come.
Very good.
You betcha. I've even even seeked out some of your speaking engagements that I find on YouTube, and I catch one of those once in a while.
Lots of Jim Santello there, right? Right. Very good.
You betcha.
Thanks for that, Dana.
Excuse me. So I'd like to bring up the Fox News revelations.
Yes.
Excuse me. And so, most of us that are informed and keep ourselves informed, we've known for a long time what Fox is and what they're all about. But this is definitely revealing to a large majority of America. And first of all, I don't know what the laws allow the government to do about such a blatant propaganda network in our airwaves. But that aside, I'm wondering what you anticipate, how public this will end up getting, what it will do to the lexicon in this nation, and what you anticipate that may do to Fox as a viable network.
Right.
I'll take your analysis off the air. Thank you so much, Jim.
Dana, thanks so much for calling in, because that's a perfect segue into this first story. And I'm going to spend some time talking about that. Other callers, stay on the line with me. I'll get to you, I promise. But I'm going to spend some time not only responding to Dana, but also because it's at the top of our agenda. So let's go back and do a little bit of history. As Dana indicated, it was about a year ago, late March of 2022, that we first began to hear about all these kinds of concerns about Dominion Voting Systems, an election technology company that was at the center of what was then and remains this completely baseless pro-Trump conspiracy about rigged voting machines. So what happens is that way back, again, a year or so ago, even 2 years or so ago, Dominion begins to push back on this notion that somehow it was responsible for the big lie. It was responsible for undermining the election of 2020. And in particular, files a lawsuit a major defamation lawsuit. Again, in response to Dana's very good questions here, this is a civil proceeding. It's not criminal in nature, brought by Dominion, the leadership of Dominion saying, you know what? It is not true. It is not true that we are responsible through our machines, through our activities, for undermining the 2020 election. And they filed that lawsuit, as Dana just so appropriately said, accurately said, against what? Against Fox News. And its powerful owner, a fellow named Rupert Murdoch, someone we all know well. And they allege in that lawsuit, speaking about $1.6 billion in damages, that the things that Fox News has said on the broadcast, on its broadcast, many, many different talking heads on that network, on that so-called news station, indicating that Dominion and its voting machines are somehow responsible for undermining the election, simply false, completely untrue, and significantly, the news that comes out of this past week, knowing that information presented in the course of their Fox News broadcast was in fact untrue. You may recall well that Dominion also sued Rudy Giuliani and Sidney Powell, same kind of thing, for their statements also in public forums identifying that Dominion somehow was responsible for undermining that election. And again, at the time of the filing of the lawsuit, very important, the Dominion's lawyers said this: the truth matters. The truth matters. Lies have consequences. Fox sold a false story of election fraud in order to serve its own commercial purposes, severely injuring Dominion in the process. That's the damages. That's why they're seeking about $1.6 billion. And the lawyers at the time went on to say, if this case does not rise to the level of defamation, that is materially false statements in the public domain about what this entity, Dominion, did and did not do, then nothing does. Dominion was founded in 2002, again, as I said before, one of the largest manufacturers of voting machine equipment in the United States, about 24 states or so, including several that were actually carried by the former president, Donald Trump, in the 2020 election, used that equipment. These allies of Donald Trump falsely portrayed Dominion in the past and to this day as biased toward Mr. Biden and the ultimate president, as we know well. And they argued, without any evidence, which is the focus of the lawsuit, that somehow Dominion was tied to Hugo Chavez, the long-dead Venezuelan president, and the founder of Dominion, a fellow named John Poulos, and other employees in the wake of that were on the receiving end of harassing, threatening messages from people who were convinced that the company had undermined these election results. Again, a part of the damages suffered by them. In addition to all of this, in addition to this particular focus, we know well that Dominion's lawyers identified sort of an unusual argument made by Sidney Powell in a motion. And it also underscores the ridiculousness of this proposition that somehow, number one, the election was stolen, number two, that Dominion was responsible. In the lawsuit against Sidney Powell, again, a separate lawsuit, in the course of that litigation, her lawyers asserted that because the political language is often inexact, they said this: no reasonable person would accept those claims, Sidney Powell's claims, as fact. That motion effectively arguing that Sidney Powell's claims, his statements by her, by Rudy Giuliani, and frankly by others on Fox News, were so completely crazy that no reasonable person could possibly understand them to be real, that they're hyperbolic and therefore not defamatory. Well, very nice try, very nice try. That notion that these are so ridiculous that you couldn't possibly interpret them as being real. Nonetheless, the lawsuit continues. Why is it back in the news today? Why are we talking about it with Dana, with all of you? Well, this past week, further confirmation that that lawsuit filed a while back not only has legs, Dana, to respond to your question, but is one of these very unusual cases that normally are maybe dismissed because of the high standards that need to be shown in these kinds of cases. In a defamation lawsuit brought by a company against a media provider. We'll talk about that in just a minute, a case called New York Times versus Sullivan, a very high standard to meet when you're attacking a news media outlet, a provider of news out there. This one may not only survive that, but an awful lot of information provided just this past week to suggest there is evidence of exactly that, of defamation and of actual malice by the Fox stars and the Fox leadership. What happened this past week? In connection with the continuing pretrial litigation, again, this lawsuit scheduled to go to trial, according to the judge, in April, just a couple of months from now, scheduled for jury selection beginning in April. What happened in the anticipation of that trial is briefs are written, right, by parties in the context of litigation posturing. And during the course of those brief exchanges, BRIEF, not meaning small, but memorandums of litigation position, we heard for some of the first times some of the specific representations, communications among the Fox leadership, among those folks who are on the air, confirming that not only did they recognize that the big lie was just that there was nothing to this notion that the 2020 election had been stolen, but importantly, that they knew it. Host Tucker Carlson, Sean Kennedy, Laura Ingraham, names perhaps you all have seen on the news, maybe you sometimes watch Fox News, repeatedly even insulted and mocked Trump advisors, according to some of the internal communications now gotten by Dominion as the plaintiff in this lawsuit and produced in connection with these legal memorandums being written. All those also include Sidney Powell, Rudy Giuliani, a lot of text messages being exchanged. Here is at least one of them. During the course of an exchange between Tucker Carlson and Laura Ingraham, Tucker Carlson writes this: Sidney Powell is lying, by the way. I caught her. It's insane, he says. He writes that on November 18th of 2020, very shortly after the 2020 election. Laura Ingraham responds, Sidney is a complete nut. No one will work with her. Ditto with Rudy. These are things that they themselves said to each other in text at the same time as they're on the air talking about stealing and having stolen the election through these Dominion machines. Carlson comes back and says, our viewers are good people and they believe it. He added, making clear that plainly he did not. Now, we know all of this because this is being produced in the context of a partially redacted filing, about 192 pages of this past week, that contain these revelations about these deliberations inside the network. Fox, needless to say, has attempted very strongly to keep much of this evidence against it under seal. And again, we're probably going to hear more about that in the future. But this is the first insight into this notion that inside Fox in particular, they knew about and they nonetheless continued to perpetuate this notion that the 2020 election was stolen. On one occasion, the owner of the Fox News, Rupert Murdoch, this powerful owner, actually watched Rudy Giuliani and Sidney Powell on television, and he told a woman named Suzanne Scott, the chief executive of Fox News Media, terrible stuff damaging everybody, I fear. That's Rupert Murdoch, again, disclosed just this past week. This same brief that I'm talking about depicts Ms. Scott, again, this chief executive of the Fox News Media. Colleagues described her as sharply attuned to the sensibilities of the Fox audience, that plainly establishing that she was well aware that Trump's claims were completely baseless. And when another Murdoch-owned property named the New York Post, you may know that well, published an editorial urging Trump to stop complaining that he had not been cheated out of the election, Ms. Scott, again, this chief executive of news media, Fox News Media, distributed that widely among her staff. And Murdoch actually thanked her for doing so. Lots and lots of those kinds of revelations during the course of these past 8 months. How do we get this? This happens in discovery. That is the production, the necessary production in a civil case. And let me make a couple more comments before we take some more callers and begin to digest this a little bit. I mentioned before that all this is analyzed under the predicate, the structure of a case called New York Times versus Sullivan. And it falls upon Dominion now as a part of this civil lawsuit to prove that Fox acted with actual malice. Actual malice. This is the long-standing standard that requires Dominion to prove that Fox either it's through its guests, its hosts, its executives, knew what was going on, was being said on the air, was false, and allowed it anyway, or that people inside Fox perhaps were recklessly negligent in failing to check the accuracy of their coverage. In this particular case, highly likely the Dominion will be able to meet that very high standard. We're going to talk more about that high standard when we come back after this break. New York Times versus Sullivan, the fact that these revelations can in fact support that high standard. And then we're going to talk a little bit more about a couple more things said, disclosed during the course of discovery just this past week. Stay with us for that continuing discussion. Welcome back. We are talking this morning about news in America that further reaffirms the notion that the 2020 presidential election was not in fact stolen by anybody, nor was it the result of election machines, including those owned and operated by Dominion. Talking before the break about this lawsuit, a lawsuit that is now looking more and more credible with each passing day, and the disclosures just this past week of things said among the on-air hosts, among guests, among leadership, that suggests not only did Fox News know that what it was saying to America was false, but did so purposefully and willfully. I mentioned before, right before the break, that Fox needs to show actual malice, this standard that requires that Dominion prove that Fox guests, its hosts, executives, knew what was going on and the air was false, allowed it anyway, or that people inside Fox, its employees, its leadership, were recklessly negligent in failing to check the accuracy of their coverage. Again, Dominion seeking about $1.6 billion against Fox for that defamation and the damages that it and its individual leadership members suffered. A final thing before we get to some additional callers on this, in response to Dana's specific question about whether or not this particular lawsuit will have an impact. It should, Dana. It should. Why? Because it does underscore the notion that in America, even under New York Times versus Sullivan, there are standards by which journalists and media placement platforms out there need to conform. And this is one of them. This is a situation where you do have a clear set of evidence that indeed Fox News was violating the fundamental civil principles of defamation. Listen to this. Dominion's goal, of course, aside from convincing the jury that Fox knowingly spread these lies, plainly is to build a case, to Dana's point, that goes straight to the top of Fox and sends this message not only to the Fox media executives, the empire, Rupert Murdoch, but all members of the family there, if you will, the corporate family who are responsible for this, also should send, Dana, a message to all Americans. The Dominion filing, this past week, says this: Fox knew from the top down, Fox knew. That same brief cites senior executives and editors, not on-air people, responsible for shaping Fox's coverage behind the scenes, who weren't buying into this election denial scheme either. And finally, no reasonable person would have thought that. This is from the network's politics editor at the time. His name is Chris Stylewart. He was referring, of course, to the allegation that Dominion rigged the election. He said, no reasonable person would have thought that. Bill Salmon, Fox's managing editor, again, information disclosed this past week, quoted as saying this, it's remarkable how weak ratings make good journalists do bad things. Wow. Condemning statements, inflammatory statements, and revelatory of a so-called news station that plainly on this and probably many other issues, knowingly deceiving the American public, people who watch it, into believing something that they knew is not true. To answer your question, Dana, this lawsuit does have legs. We will see what happens come April. It's possible it may settle out of court. An awful lot of people would love to have all of this displayed in the courtroom, where we would also be able to see that publicly. Possible that Dominion could settle. It's seeking, again, this huge amount, $1.6 billion in compensatory damages. That could always happen. but damage done here. Damage done here, frankly, to Fox, of course, and its reputation, but also to America. And that's the larger point, which is by perpetuating this lie for more than 2 years now, convincing people that indeed the 2020 election was fraudulent, that it was somehow undermined by Dominion, that somehow it was not the result of legitimate voting across the country, knowing that that's not true, and reaffirming the fundamental principle of today's program, which is the 2020 election did have legitimacy to it. So, Dana, thank you very much for opening up the door to that exposition of that first major news story of this morning. We're going to continue with our discussion of that and perhaps other stories. Dick, calling in from Madison. Dick, glad to have you with us again this morning.
I just like to second Dana's opening. It's a great show. Question. It's a little off topic, but it swirls around the former president.
Yes.
I saw Michael Cohen on Thursday on Nicole Wallace's show, and I wasn't aware of this. But they said that he had been subpoenaed by a law firm. Now, he said, I've communicated some 16 times with this ongoing investigation. And these attorneys for Trump now, I wasn't aware that a law firm or attorneys could subpoena somebody. I thought that was for the courts or a judge to do.
Right. So,
and it sounds like what they're trying to do is portray their subpoena into, looking like they're actually part of the whole investigation. And it just struck me as weird hearing about a subpoena from a law firm.
Right. And so, Dick, I will tell you that I did not see that particular item of news. I do know that in connection with the 16 appearances, I believe that what Michael Cohen was talking about in that connection was that he continues to work with what? He continues to work with the Manhattan DA's office, DA Bragg there, who is continuing to do an investigation of Donald Trump, specifically related to finances and this so-called catch and kill situation where monies were paid to Stormy Daniels and one other woman for being quiet about affairs that the president, the now former and then future president, had with them during the 2016 election. Alvin Bragg is continuing to investigate that. And I do know that Michael Cohen has talked about his repeated appearances before investigators inside that government entity that continues to look at that particular matter, a matter that was also effectively abandoned, if you will, by the United States Department of Justice under the Trump administration, under the administration of a former attorney general named Bill Barr, you know well. But it may well be that there are some other attorneys out there. We know well that civil litigators can, in fact, initiate lawsuits, can certainly talk to witnesses in advance of doing that. I did not hear that particular item of news, but your point is still well taken, Dick, regardless of where this was and what Michael Cohen may or may not have said about his engagement. He plainly continues to work with state law enforcement in New York State as they continue to investigate Donald Trump. And again, these efforts to undermine our election in when? 2016. He talked in particular about the fact that initially the conversations he was having were very at the high level, went from sort of chapters ultimately to paragraphs, ultimately to sentences, and now to a granularity that he is providing to them. Plainly, he has cooperated a huge amount, not only with the state, but also ultimately with the federal government. Michael Cohen, the only person to go to prison, a federal conviction, a federal sentence, spent time in federal prison for his involvement in that undermining of our election back in 2016. We're going to talk more about that and other matters as we go into our second hour. Callers, stay on the line. We've got a lot of discussion this morning about the 2020 election, 2016 election, and other matters related to the future of democracy.
Welcome. Grab your favorite morning beverage and join us for Morning Cannolis with Jim Santel.
You don't know me, but I'm your brother.
Sampling the news desserts of the week, here is your host, Jim Santel.
Welcome to our second hour here, our discussion, our analysis, our review of those major stories in government and law and the aspiration for justice in America. In our first hour, spending a lot of time talking to some of you calling in at 844-967-2789 about this major story this past week having to do with Dominion voting machines and the likely success that that company will have in proving its case of defamation against Fox News for knowingly putting on the air the notion that Dominion was responsible for somehow compromising the 2020 election, and more broadly, Fox News knowing to this day that the 2020 election was not stolen, was not the product of some illegal undermining, but nonetheless continuing to pursue that notion, that reporting on the air as revealed by many of the internal texts. An awful lot of information also suggesting that Dominion did this. Why? Because they were concerned about defecting viewers, people who might have been impacted by their announcement early on that Donald Trump had won the state of Arizona, probably won the entire, had lost the state of Arizona and had lost the entire 2020 election. As a result of that, concern about people leaving the network, and seemed concerned about the impact that this news would have, this announcement would have on even their profitability, and that justifying internal to Fox News the notion that we lie and we go ahead to maintain those viewers, to keep them on the air, to keep them tuning in, even though we know that what we're saying on the air is false and that we do not in fact believe the very things that we're saying. Looking forward to the trial of that in April, and looking forward to some disposition of that should be in the attention span, the attention focus of all Americans, looking not only in Fox News in this area, but in other areas as well. A much related news story also, kind of a footnote to that, kind of fell under the radar on many newspaper headlines, but nonetheless important, revealed this past week that during the course of the right after the 2020 election, the Trump organization commissioned a group called the Berkeley Research Group to analyze voting data from about 6 states around the country, specifically asking them to probe whether there was any fraud, any irregularities that occurred in the 2020 election. The focus of their time period, this assignment from the Trump campaign, was right after the 2020 election, again, when Donald Trump lost the election to Joe Biden, and the remaining weeks of 2020, and right before the January 6th insurrection of 2021 at the United States Capitol. This commission to Berkeley Research Group to try to figure out whether there was any actual fraud. Areas of focus for the probe were voter machine malfunctions, things like allegations that great numbers of deceased individuals had voted, some other evidence perhaps that could point to a Trump victory, again, according to the reporting on this commission given to this investigative research group. Comes back, turns out the report comes back and says, nope, no indication whatsoever that there was in fact any voter fraud. Comes back with just the opposite result, that Joe Biden won the key swing states of Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, Pennsylvania, and yes, right here in Wisconsin, which were all a part of that Berkeley analysis, but were long deemed to be highly competitive during the presidential cycle. They basically looked at everything. They looked at change of addresses, illegal immigrants, ballot harvesting, this notion of capturing ballots of other people and turning them in, people voting twice, machines being tampered with, ballots that were sent to vacant addresses that were returned and voted. All these kinds of crazy theories out there that would suggest that the vote had been skewed. This company comes back and says, Trump campaign, nothing there, nothing to look at, nothing to digest, literally everything you could think of. They investigated, and the voter turnout anomalies, all these kinds of things alleged by the Trump campaign, turns out none of them are true. The reporting on this, and coming out this week, not only of that report, but the fact, of course, that in the wake of the receipt of that report by the Trump campaign, the decision not to release it. Not to release, again, further information that the Trump campaign and the president at that time knew that he had lost, and his own commissioned analysis through this Berkeley Research Group proved just that. The news this past week of the commissioning of that report, the return of that report finding no fraud, and the decision by the Trump campaign not to release it. A parallel, a bookend, if you will, to our discussion about what's going on in Fox News as well. This notion that we know what the truth is, and we're purposefully saying just the opposite. We've got another caller on the line, Jean from Eau Claire. You've called in this morning. Thank you so much for being with us this morning.
Well, thank you so much. Hey, outstanding. I wish you had longer. I wish we had more of you every week. It's just outstanding. So I'll get real quick to the point. This seems like a criminal enterprise to me, with its tendrils all over in all of our states, all the money that's been wasted, all the lies that have been spread that really attacks the very premise of our democracy and our voting with outright fraudulent lies. And, who investigates something like this? Because this is detrimental to everyone. I mean, even the severe increases in psychological depression, older people, suicides, things like this. Because when we see reality altered like they have by these type of means, this is significant impacts on everybody's lives. And who would be responsible for some kind of remedies to make sure this doesn't happen again, to make sure these people are punished, and who is protecting the people, because this has been devastating. It's broken families up. All kinds of money's been spent. Look at our state with the big fake investigation that's over $2 million now, and it still keeps going.
It keeps going.
Fox still hasn't spoken out what they've spread. I mean, what can we do as people, and who is responsible? Who's responsible for remedies and maybe some, punishments and things like that? Because we were in bad shape there. I watched live. I was watching when that happened, and I've never seen anything like it. And we never want this to happen again.
Absolutely. Jean,
thank you so much for everything you're doing.
Absolutely. Jean, appreciate all those good comments. Again, going to the question, why is this important and what do we do about it, right? And so, again, all callers, tremendously insightful. I'm going to unpackage a couple of things that you said, Jean, there. First of all, the impact on this big lie upon our nation. Again, Dominion talks about its loss of profitability and $1.6 billion in damages. And we talk about other things related to the impact upon individuals, which is huge. It is catastrophic. And we'll get to Georgia in just a moment by virtue of your invitation and the syllabus we have this morning. But beyond that, a great point, Jean, the impact upon our national psyche, right? This notion that we're spending all this time believing that somehow our elections are not credible, that people who are responsible, clerks, local clerks, poll workers, all those kinds of people who we will see again this Tuesday and then again in April in the state of Wisconsin as we vote here in the days and weeks just ahead, that somehow this process is not credible. And beyond that, that our entire psyche, our nation generally has been corrupted, if you will, by virtue of bad elections. Nothing could be further from the truth. And so it's very important, to your very good point, Gene, that not only we push back on these things, the Dominion lawsuit, other things we're going to talk about in this very hour, and the answer to the question, who remedies this? Well, in part, we all remedy it, right? All of us as citizens should be out there talking about the results of this discovery released in the Dominion lawsuit this just past week. You've got statements by the very people on the air, Laura Ingraham, Tucker Carlson, Sean Hannity, acknowledging that these other people, in their words, are nuts, and nonetheless going on the air and saying just the opposite. Talk about that, right? Articulate that out there to establish that the people, including the former president, who continue to articulate this unsupported view, are simply wrong, and they're doing it out of malice. They're doing it out of an attempt to continue to acquire and maintain power and for money. Beyond that, the very practical response, Gene, to your very good question is, who remedies this? Well, there are some government entities that are remedying this, and that leads us to our next two stories, again, at the core of our discussion. Let's go to Georgia, as I indicated. We know from our past discussions a woman named Fani Willis. She is the DA in Fulton County, that's basically Atlanta in Georgia. She has been conducting for about 2 years, this investigation of whether or not Donald Trump and many other people undermined the Georgia election. You may recall well his call to Brad Raffensperger, who's the Secretary of State, looking looking for additional votes so that he could be declared the winner of the electoral votes coming out of Georgia. That's what we all know. We've heard that on tape repeatedly. Fani Willis obviously expanding the investigation to determine not just whether Donald Trump intended and had the purpose of trying to undermine that vote, but what others did as well. And so she has called many, many people in front of a special grand jury over the period of the past year or so, and those number about 75 altogether, to determine whether or not there is a basis for returning charges for violations of Georgia election law. Things done by Donald Trump, things done by others, including, once again, Rudy Giuliani, other people who may have been involved in misrepresentations to the Georgia legislature, to the people of Georgia generally about what had happened and what had not happened in Georgia. Investigating all that before this special fact-finding grand jury. Fani Willis supervising that. This past week, major news, maybe the most important news of the week coming out of Georgia. What did that special grand jury find? We know about three things, at least three things coming out of that special grand jury, because the judge who's presiding over this process ordered released some portions of the report of that special grand jury. He released an introductory period, a portion of it. He released a conclusory portion of it, and then some internal information as well. And this is basically what the report says coming out of Georgia. Once again, consistent with our theme this morning, you've got 26 people on a grand jury reviewing all this evidence over a period of months in Georgia. And what do they find? No fraud. No fraud whatsoever. As the state attorney general, the others in Georgia establish, no fraud. When we come back, we're going to talk about the other major findings coming out of this report released just this past week out of Georgia. We're going to talk about the likelihood of charges coming out of the state of Georgia for this kind of behavior. We'll talk about that right after this coming break. Welcome back. We are talking in this second hour of our Saturday morning broadcast about this major news coming out of Fulton County, Georgia. That is the partial release report of a special grand jury convened by Fani Willis, the DA there in Atlanta. And what is that special grand jury? Again, a group of 26 people, citizens out there brought together to review information, to hear witnesses, to review documents, and recommend, make findings about what they saw before them. What did they say first? Unanimously. All 26 of them, according to the report, the portion of it released by the judge, unanimously, every single one of them rebutted claims of widespread fraud in Georgia. That is the kind of thing we're talking about all this morning on our broadcast. Nothing bad happened in the 2020 election to suggest that Donald Trump did in fact win, when in fact Joe Biden won the election. We know that. And it's true in Georgia as well. That's what the special grand jury found as a result of its about 7 or 8 month investigation of all of this. During the course of that investigation, now again, a portion of that released, about 75 people altogether testified before that grand jury. We know some of them. We know that those included Rudy Giuliani. We know that David Schaefer, the head of the Georgia Republican Party, also appeared before that grand jury. Other notable people that we've talked about on this show, their names: Lindsey Graham, the senator from South Carolina, appearing there in front of that special grand jury based upon his attempts, his communications to perhaps impact the election there as well. Mark Meadows, also the now former chief of staff of the White House for Donald Trump, also testified, presumably, before that grand jury. And what does the grand jury say about some of that testimony? We don't know exactly who, but the grand jury also says, and this is a majority of them believe, that perjury may have been committed by one or more witnesses. Perjury may have been committed by one or more of those witnesses. Again, we don't know exactly who it was who committed perjury, but significant that majorities say that. The other reason, a footnote to that, the reason why that's so significant is you've got a grand jury here who's winnowing and sifting. Why? How do you know that? Because a majority, again, not all of them, not all the grand jurors, not all 26 of them found that perjury may have occurred. With respect to no fraud, all of them did this. So there's some disagreement among the members of this grand jury. That's a good thing. That shows you that these people are analyzing what is before them, and they're coming to these conclusions based upon a reasoned, critical analysis of the information before them. The catalyst, again, for this investigation, as we all know, this call made by Donald Trump to Brad Raffensperger, the Secretary of State, pressing him to find 11,780 votes, one more than he needs to obtain all the Electoral College votes coming out of Georgia. Significant, not only because of the findings here, but because of what is going to happen next. Fani Willis has said already that she is going to be presumably making some charging decisions imminently. Those are coming out imminently. That's her word, not mine. And she's also talked about future defendants. All of these more than tea leaves indicating that charges are going to come out of Georgia very soon. She's got the obligation now under state law to present the findings of this special grand jury to a charging grand jury, a second body of people. They will be sworn in about 10 days from now, 10 to 12 days from now in early March. And they will then be presented with the results of the special grand jury findings. And then Fani Willis can make determinations about what she would like them to do. She only has the power to recommend. It is still a grand jury that has the decision-making authority to return or not return charges. They're the ones who are going to make the decision about those charges. But she is plainly going to make recommendations to them about what she feels these results of the special grand jury show. Highly likely that among some of these people who testified, she is going to recommend charges, and that may very well include the former president, Donald Trump. And so we need to anticipate that sometime, the prediction here is sometime in March, maybe April, but it's probably March, she is going to be announcing publicly some charges coming out of this charging grand jury, imminently coming, future defendants, as she said, related to whether or not there was fraud committed, an attempt to commit fraud, not successful, but an attempt nonetheless to undermine the election through the words, the actions of Donald Trump and other people in his ambit for doing just that. That will be huge news. If that happens, that will be, of course, the first time in our nation's history that a former president is charged with a crime. And so we need to be very thoughtful and attentive to that news when it comes out. It's possible she could do this in a number of different indictments. She could charge a group of people initially. Maybe some of those will include some of the people we've identified here, maybe not. Could be that she will return an omnibus indictment. We've talked about the RICO possibility, charging a large corporate entity, if you will, with trying to undermine the election there in Georgia. All kinds of options available to her, but probably happening in the weeks and certainly months just ahead. Huge news coming up out of Georgia from the pen not only of Fani Willis, but also significantly this convened charging grand jury in Fulton County that sometime soon is going to tell us what's going to happen with the results of this nearly year-long grand jury review, almost a 2-year analysis by Fani Willis and the DA's office there in Fulton County. Looking forward to all of that. Significantly, a final comment about this, and then we're going to take some callers right after the break. Donald Trump, in response to this release this past week, portrayed the contents very differently. In a post on Truth Social, he wrote, "Thank you, special grand jury, the great state of Georgia. Total exoneration. The USA is very proud of you." Misunderstanding completely that the very fact that he was not mentioned signals that likely he is a target of this investigation. The fact that he was not called as a witness suggests strongly that he may in fact be among those defendants. Right after the break, we're trying to talk more about the implications of all of this. Stay with us for that further discussion. talking this morning about all things election 2020, the fact that there was no fraud and Joe Biden was properly elected our president, contrary to what Donald Trump, contrary to what people at Fox News and other places continue to articulate into America. Right before the break, we were talking about this report released by a district court judge in Fulton County of the findings by a special grand jury investigating whether there was an attempt to undermine the election results in Georgia by the former president and by other people. Finding, again, no fraud in the voting itself, nothing to see here suggesting that the vote was not properly done. Second, that people may have committed perjury among the 75 witnesses, and plainly recommending that Fani Willis, who is the DA, pursue charges against some people. Now, significantly in this excerpt from the report, no indication of who those people may be, but plainly indicating that there was an attempt in Georgia to do what's contrary to Georgia law. Right before the break, I was talking about the misunderstanding by Donald Trump about the results of this. He congratulates the grand jury for exonerating him when, in fact, just the opposite is true. Under Georgia law, prosecutors are prohibited from calling into a grand jury people that they know to be a target, that is, a likely defendant of a case. They can call in subjects, witnesses, but targets, for the most part, probably not. And in fact, they're prohibited from doing that. And so the very fact that Donald Trump was not called in among these other witnesses suggests that he may be on the list of targets. And of course, beyond that, we just don't know. We just don't know who is on the list of people that this special grand jury identified as being responsible for the attempt to overthrow the election results. Unsuccessful, but nonetheless the attempt in Georgia. We appreciate so much our callers calling in at 844-967-2789. Joe, you have been waiting for a very long time. Joe, thanks for calling back in this morning. Always appreciate your good comment and your thoughtful perspectives.
Thanks as always, Jim. Just a terrific show yet again, chock full of information. And I know you had said at the head of the show that you and your producer are looking at doing a 3-parter starting next week about the Supreme Court and trying to elucidate that and educate us even more about that institution. I would add into that, and this extends out to the Dominion case, that one of the things that you also were highlighting, that this is the anniversary of a decision about Japanese interning Japanese Americans during World War II and the injustice of that. I would add into that discussion, and I hope to broaden this a little bit by saying I knew a woman who from the Seattle area whose grandpa had been and grandma had been affected by that. They were rounded up and taken away from their property in Washington State. They had a farm, they had a house, and she said one of the most outrageous things, in addition to their losing their freedom, is that they lost their property. They lost their house and their farm. And I think about that when I think about the generational losses that can occur from particular decisions that are made, such as the Dred Scott decision or this one. So I would hope that in your series on the Supreme Court that you might just give a moment to think of this little suggestion of recognizing that these cases can come down to individual people or individual business. In the case of Dominion, I remember reading that a lawyer had said about this case 6-8 months ago that he'd never seen such a slam dunk in defamation. Now, that's not necessarily, I mean, nothing's a slam dunk, I don't think, in law. But one of the points he made was it is clear that all sorts of people purchasing on a statewide level an election system, if this injustice were not addressed, would say, well, we can't trust Dominion. And there is a monetary cost in the same way that Japanese Americans who lost property and lost the years that they might have been working and earning money had a monetary hit from what happened to them. And so I just think it's important to recognize that this Dominion case is not necessarily $1.6 billion in damages just because they have hurt feelings. It has to do with the fact that their product has been slammed and a business that they had spent a great deal of energy and time and money creating, and the employees that are involved, the shareholders that are involved, are hurt by the inaccurate, wrong words of people like the hosts of Fox News. So I guess I just wanted to tie it up to It's individual and its consequences,
Yes.
even though we're talking about big court decisions.
Right,
Thanks
right.
a lot, Jim. I'll listen to your response out
Joe,
there.
always so very, very thoughtful. And yes, I will not only take that commission, Calvin and I will, as we go into these series of Supreme Court cases. We are going to be highlighting some things, exactly as you said, Joe, that cases that are out there in the public domain, we don't recognize the way in which they continue to have tendrils into 2023. Absolutely. Things like the Korematsu decision that affirmed this internment executive order by FDR that basically codified it into American law. Now, we know that in 1948, shortly after that executive order was issued, almost immediately, people began to recognize that there was, in fact, as Joe you just said, this very individual impact, not just a big policy horror, but an impact upon individuals. And so 1948, the American Evacuation Claims Act that made some token payments for some commercial losses didn't come anywhere near contemplating compensating all the people who are affected by that internment. And again, as I said before, in 1988, an attempt additionally, $20,000 to people who were affected. Again, a pure pittance, right, when it comes to trying to redress the grievances that they legitimately have. And Joe, your very good point about that and also Dominion, that these kinds of things we talk about in our history, they're all taking place on the plane of individual people, families, mothers, fathers, sons, daughters, uncles, aunts, children, right? Property, individual relationships. They have this huge impact. And the same is true, Joe, as you just said about this Dominion lawsuit. It is an impact upon the credibility of Dominion and its capacity down the road to continue to sell its products, even as those may change down the road and advance as its own technology advances. We all know that even the pendency of the lawsuit sometimes prompts people to say, well, gee, wasn't that company involved in that lawsuit? There was an allegation of something improper. Well, it turns out, yeah, they were involved in the lawsuit. Turns out they're completely untrue. And I would join the lawyer whose words you had consumed, Joe. This may not be a slam dunk, but under New York Times versus Sullivan, actual malice, it is difficult to imagine a case where the evidence is more compelling than it is in this instance. And again, if it goes to trial, fascinating to watch it being presented in a courtroom of the United States of America. Again, the impact upon that company. But even if it's settled, comments made by Dominion and others talking about the impact, yes, financially upon the corporation, and more broadly, again, to your very important point, the impact upon individuals inside the company, and yes, indeed, on all of us, right? This continuing lie perpetuated by Fox News, by the former president, by people in his ambit that suggests that what happened in 2020 was not real and should be revisited and taken back. Completely wrong. The impact, as you and some other callers have indicated, on individuals and upon all of us, a huge impact upon the history of America. I will take up that invitation, Joe. Thank you for making it. We're going to be talking about those kinds of things in these upcoming shows. Let's also talk, again, beyond just what's happening in the grand jury, the special grand jury, the indicting grand jury in Georgia. Let's also go back to Washington, D.C. A while back, Gene asked about who remedies these things, who takes care of them. Well, we know that in addition to the state remedies having to do with the investigation that we just talked about in Georgia, we also know that the federal government, the U.S. Department of Justice, under Jack Smith, who is the AG, the Attorney General appointed special counsel, is looking also at January 6th and more broadly at attempts to undermine the election, not just on that day, but also before and after. Some significant news coming out of his work, again, in Washington, D.C., related in terms of substance, but in a different jurisdiction, right? Difference between Fani Willis in the state of Georgia and Jack Smith, and yes, the Attorney General in the federal government in Washington, D.C., looking at the same kinds of things, determining whether there should be federal charges issued against the former president, against others who might also be facing some criminal culpability in the state of Georgia, maybe other places as well. What happened just this past week? Two significant things that indicate that Jack Smith, again, as a part of his grand jury work, his focus there in Washington, D.C., he has also convened at least one, Maybe there was a prior grand jury as well, but at least one grand jury, again, 26 people under the federal rules of criminal procedure, called in, summoned in to hear evidence of federal crimes. We know that he is presenting an awful lot of witnesses in the same way that Fani Willis is doing the same sorts of things in Georgia. He is also calling in witnesses to do what? To ask them about conversations that they had with each other, text messages, communications, memorandums, all things written, conversations with the president before January 6th, during January 6th, on that day, after January 6th, to figure out whether or not there was an intent, whether or not there was a purpose, a knowing attempt to try to undermine the election. The president certainly, once again, on the top of that target list of that investigation as well. You can do both. You can do a state prosecution and a federal prosecution charged under different statutes, a different regime, if you will, of criminal laws. One does not prohibit the other. One does not preempt the other. Oftentimes, judges will make decisions about which case will go first. But the fact that we have these two parallel proceedings going on, federal grand jury under Jack Smith and his people in Washington, D.C., Fani Willis in Georgia, also pursuing the same kinds of things under Georgia law. This past week, Jack Smith does what? He does two very significant things. He subpoenas in two additional fact witnesses. Frankly, as I look at this, I wonder aloud why it is these folks have not appeared previously. I think on the lists of anybody that you would call in trying to figure out what happened in Washington on January 6th, who would you put at the top of those lists? Who would that be? That would be Mike Pence, right? The vice president at the time. What was he doing at the time? He was standing there with Nancy Pelosi. And what were they doing in the well of the Congress? They were counting electoral votes coming in from all 50 states. They were doing what the Constitution prescribes. James Madison, George Mason prescribed 200 years ago. And it was in the midst of that that the Capitol was under siege, this attack, this attempt at insurrection. And plainly, a lot of people have a lot of insight, a lot of information about what happened that day. But we know that Mike Pence had conversations with the now former president on that day, certainly before that day. We believed from some of the reporting that the former president called his own vice president a wimp for not doing what the president wanted him to do, which is find that the electoral votes should not be counted or that they were invalid. So Mike Pence subpoenaed in to appear before this grand jury to talk about, presumably, the things that he said and that the former president said to him. Pence already indicated that he is going to fight that subpoena. And so Jack Smith, along with other cases already pending in the federal district court under the chief judge there, is going to be fighting that under a theory of attorney-client, or rather executive privilege between the vice president and the president. And again, the significant point to make there is executive privilege protects an awful lot of things, including discussions about substance. Does not include discussions about what? About crime. And if there are discussions in an attempt to overthrow the nation, to undermine the electoral count, the process established by the Constitution, that is not protected by executive privilege. And so a judge will ultimately find that that privilege does not apply. But we know now that Jack Smith is going to be contesting the position taken by the vice president coming up now in the federal district court. We also know that Jack Smith did one other thing, and that is he also subpoenaed the former chief of staff, Mark Meadows. Again, an individual with an awful lot of information, presumably lots of conversations with the president before, during, and after January 6th. Key fact witnesses before the grand jury in Washington, D.C., and again, likely going to be contested by the former chief of staff, Mark Meadows. All of that coming up as a part of that federal investigation. We're going to talk about a couple of other matters in our final moments here on the broadcast. Stay with us for that right after this break. to our final segment on our Saturday morning broadcast, but still a lot of territory to pursue in these last moments, including another caller, Jack from Merrimack, calling in. Appreciate your comment, your thought, or your perspective this morning, Jack.
Yeah, I'm just wondering when this whole thing is going to actually be over. It's been over 2 years. The guy that basically fomented a rebellion against the United States of America is now running to go back into office so he can do the same thing again. Even Mitch McConnell, after hypocritically voting to acquit him during the impeachment trial, stated about Trump, there is, and I think this is pretty close to the quote, there is no question, none, that President Trump is practically and morally responsible for January 6th. I mean, when are they going to start charging these guys? This is ridiculous. I'm sorry, but it is.
And Jack, you know, your sense of outrage, I think, is well placed. It has been well over 2 years, right, since the insurrection of 2021. We know that some of this conspiracy was happening even before that time period. And as much as it is important, absolutely, to cross T's and dot I's, both with respect to state prosecutions, state investigations, and federal investigations, we know that there are an awful lot of people, including, for example, our last story of the day is going to be talking about, again, the Proud Boys and some of the insurrection trials going on there as well. Donald Trump has still not been charged. I am hopeful. I am anticipating that coming out of Georgia, as I said in our prior segment, Fani Willis will be telling us what she is doing very, very soon. And yes, indeed, I think, Jack, your concern about timing with respect to the federal government, it has now come to that time. And even though Jack Smith is still calling these fact witnesses, we need to be focused on timeliness. Sometimes said, obviously that justice, delayed justice denied. I could not share your views more strongly and regard that as a very, very important point. Need to get done with this and need to move on then, right? Prosecute those people, including the former president, responsible for it, and then move on to a time when we put all this behind us. But that time only comes after justice is done. The rule of law applies to everyone, including a former president. Could not agree more, Jack. Jake, also calling in from Eureka. Jake, glad to have you with us this morning. Your comment or your question?
Hey, well, first I'd like to ask a question, then second I'd like to make a statement about something in the news real quick. First of all, the question is on January 6th. I haven't heard much recently about those missing Secret Service messages, the text messages. They all went missing for some reason in the day or two, around the 6th of January. First, I'd like to know if they've been found, and if so, is anybody in the Secret Service potentially going to be found to be on Trump's team in terms of overturning the election and making him dictator? And the thing in the news specifically is having to do with gun control. I mean, we just heard there's another 6-year-old in Virginia again who took a gun to school. This time they found it before he shot his teacher. And then we have, of course, the massacre in Mississippi that took place yesterday, 6 people dead. When are we going to do something about banning assault weapons nationally?
Couple of very good thoughts there, Jake. Let me respond to both of them. As to the Secret Service, we know a lot about that just because it percolated up right in connection with the January 6th House Special Select Committee, and an awful lot of information to suggest that there were the Secret Service not forthcoming about what's happening on January 6th. Huge amount of focus on that. Highly likely that Jack Smith is also looking at that portion of this investigation and determining whether or not there was even obstruction of justice in an attempt to not disclose what was going on there. The reporting by the Secret Service about what the president was doing, saying that day, highly relevant, highly material to his findings. So then I would assume that even though the House committee has concluded its work with its 500-page report, that may still be the focus of the Jack Smith grand jury investigation going on in Washington, D.C. Second, as to firearms, we're going to talk about this down the road, especially when it comes to some of the Supreme Court cases of recent time. Firearms continue to be an absolute tragedy in America, right? Too many guns, too many people access to guns, and we have these continuing situations of not just mass shootings, but human tragedy, as we're talking a lot this morning. Individuals, families destroyed, businesses destroyed, communities destroyed. I share with you your rhetorical call to our leadership, both the state system and the federal system, to do something, especially since we know what can in fact work. That in fact are things like background checks and red flag laws and all those other things that we know, assault weapons bans that worked in this country for the 10 years that they were in fact banned. Put those back in place. Put those in place, and they will have an impact upon the safety and security of our nation. And perhaps one day we don't have to confront every single week, every single day, these stories about human tragedy at the result of firearms. A final comment as we go into our last couple of minutes here about the January 6th investigation, and in particular the sedition trial. This is perhaps my favorite news story of the week, and that is it comes out of the Proud Boys prosecution that continues the trial that goes on in front of Judge Timothy Kelly. These are the folks who, again, charged with seditious conspiracy there. In the midst of this trial, in a long shot move, lawyers for 5 members of the Proud Boys who are facing these charges in connection with the January 6th attack are seeking to subpoena who? Former President Donald Trump to appear as a witness at the trial. And their concept is that they want to elicit from Mr. Trump, the former president, to persuade the jury that he, rather than the defendants themselves, instigated the crowd that stormed the Capitol on January 6th. Prosecutors plainly building their case around the fact that these 5 Proud Boys, that they were the ones who induced dozens of their own members, far-right groups, others in that mob to take the action. Unclear whether the judge, his name again, Timothy Kelly, who's overseeing this case, is going to allow the subpoena. But we know that this request has been now articulated for a second time, and that the 5 Proud Boy defendants, their names are Enrique Tarrio, Ethan Nordine, Zachary Real, Dominic Pizzola, and Joseph Biggs, may in fact be pursuing this interest in having Donald Trump appear as a witness. Now, highly unlikely that he will actually do that, but under the 6th Amendment to the Constitution, we know well that these defendants, like all others, have a right to call witnesses. Donald Trump, of course, also, as he has done in other settings, has a right to invoke his own 5th Amendment right. But an interesting story as we close out this morning's program here on the broadcast, thinking about all things January 20th, reaffirming from start to finish that elections in America, including the one this coming week, are legitimate, they're safe. Get out and vote, everybody. And we'll talk with you again next week, Saturday.
Put the Lord right